Dear students, welcome to week 11, module 4. We take up the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or what is known as UNESCO, in this module. In fact, it is a specialized agency of United Nations, and in 1945 there was a conference to discuss educational, cultural collaboration, and that is how 37 countries came together and they founded UNESCO, and it came into force in the following year in 1946. And if you look at the preamble of UNESCO, it clearly affirms that since wars begin in the minds of men, and it is again in the minds of men that the seeds for peace be sown. In other words, the defenses of peace must be also start from the minds of people. In fact, the preamble of the UNESCO says protection, promotion of human rights shall be achieved through interventions in education, culture and science, and this organization is supposed to promote collaboration among member states through education, culture and science. Now, let us look at the institutional structure of UNESCO. There are basically two main bodies. One is a general conference which represents all member states, and this general conference has the responsibility to adopt norms and conventions. In addition, it also has a responsibility to adopt recommendations or declarations. Now, in addition to this general conference, there is a executive board which consists of the representatives of 58 states elected by the general conference. In fact, it has the task of preparing the agenda of the general conference and also executing the agenda which has been adopted by the general conference. And in this task, the executive board is assisted by a permanent secretariat. Now, let us look at what kind of human rights related instruments that have been adopted by the UNESCO. In fact, there are 5 of them. First, in 1960, UNESCO adopted a convention against discrimination in education, and which was later supplemented by a protocol of 1962, and it was further revised by the protocol which was adopted in the year 1978. For instance, admission to an educational institution should be open to all, regardless of any distinctions based on sex, religion, language, color, national or social origin or other such distinctions. This UNESCO convention explicitly prohibits discrimination in the access to education on these grounds. At the same time, at times there are public assistance is provided through scholarships or other means. So, the convention also seeks to prohibit discrimination in the issues relating to public assistance. Now, secondly, UNESCO has adopted a convention in 1954 on protection of cultural heritage in the event of an armed conflict. For instance, it is a convention which comes under the international humanitarian law. You are aware of the damage that has been caused to Bamiyan Buddha in Afghanistan, or recently very precious cultural sites have been targeted in the conflict in Syria. So, at times these cultural sites which are part of a common cultural heritage of mankind can become subjects or can become objects of military attack, and it is extremely critical to see that these are protected, and this is a common heritage of mankind, and the 1954 Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property defines the cultural property and also requires the states to take steps to see that cultural property is protected in the event of an armed conflict. Now, let us turn our attention to the third convention that was adopted, or third norm that was adopted by way of a declaration by UNESCO. In fact, in 1997, UNESCO adopted a universal declaration on human genome and human rights. In fact, this declaration explicitly recognizes that there are no different races or there are no inequalities between men and races, and all human beings shall have dignity, shall be given same dignity and human rights regardless of their genetic characteristics. And this declaration also prohibits discrimination of human beings based on their genetic characteristics. Now, fourthly, UNESCO has also adopted a declaration on the responsibility of the present generation towards future generations. In fact, every generation has a responsibility to live. Often in the context of environment, this issue comes up. We are inhabitants of this planet Earth, and it is our responsibility to carry out development in such a manner that our future generations are able to enjoy, or we should leave the planet in the same shape, in the same condition as we ourselves enjoyed it. So, it is regarded as or it is called intergenerational equity, and this principle has taken root in the environmental jurisprudence enunciated by many courts across the world, and this declaration of 1997 adopted by the UNESCO talks about the responsibility of the present generation towards future generations. Fifth, in UNESCO adopted in 2001 a universal declaration on cultural diversity. It talks about the importance of cultural diversity. It says, just as biodiversity is important to nature, cultural diversity is as important to mankind. And see this interesting similarity between just as biodiversity to nature and on the same lines, cultural diversity is equally important to the mankind or the humankind. Dear students, education is a human right. International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights asserts the right to education and clearly lays down the obligations of countries for ensuring right to education. Now, we have seen how General Council of the UNESCO drafts conventions, adopts recommendations or declarations for furthering the right to education or furthering its own mandate. Now, for a long time, there was a need felt for having a individual complaint remedy mechanism within UNESCO. For instance, there are conventions that have been adopted by General Council. What if any of the rights which are mentioned in the conventions were to be violated by member states? can an individual or a group take its complaint to the UNESCO. In fact, after a great deal of thinking over this, what kind of supervisory, what kind of enforcement machinery should be created, the Executive Board of UNESCO in the year 1978, in its 104th session, adopted a unique procedure for handling complaints of rights violations which fall within the competence of UNESCO, which fall within the mandate of UNESCO. Ever since, this has come to be known as 104 procedure. In fact, taking its name from the session of the Executive Board. And now, what happens if a complaint alleging violation of the rights which are mentioned in the conventions adopted by UNESCO from an individual or a group were to be received by the Director General of UNESCO? The Director General then checks whether the complaint is admissible or not. The complaint will not be admissible in case if it is anonymous, if it is manifestly ill-founded or offensive. It will not be admissible if it is exclusively based on media reports, second-hand reports, or if the domestic remedies have not been exhausted. But in case if all these conditions are satisfied, and if the Director General deems that a particular complaint of human rights violation of the rights which are mentioned in the UNESCO conventions has been found, then the Director General forwards that complaint to the state concerned asking for a report. And once the report is received, the Director General places it before a committee on conventions and recommendations, and this committee in its wisdom may ask the state concerned for further information, and based on that and all these matters are done in a private, in a confidential manner, and thereafter the committee can form a recommendation and send it to the Executive Board of UNESCO. Now, UNESCO, as you know, has a wide mandate. It has carried out its activity for furthering mutual understanding, cooperation in the field of education, science and culture, and it has evolved a series of conventions, declarations or recommendations. Yet there have been some criticisms of its work. At times countries have withdrawn from the UNESCO, saying that it had a Western bias or sometimes about the perceived bias against Israel. In fact, currently US and Israel have threatened to walk out of the UNESCO for their own reasons, for an anti-Israeli bias. So, if you look at the overall record of UNESCO, it has been able to make some advance in the field of human rights which have been entrusted to it, particularly discrimination against education, and also in the issues of cultural heritage, in the issues of human responsibilities, but there is a lot more that needs to be done before all the rights that are mentioned in its ambit can become a full reality for the peoples across the world. Even today, a large number of people have no access to education. In fact, so it's a serious human rights violation. The moment a person is unlettered, illiterate, you can at once imagine what kind of violations can happen. He or she will not know what are his legal entitlements, and they will not be in a position to assert, thereby leading to human rights violation. And a person who is out of the education can also be trafficked for child sexual exploitation, child labor and other hazardous occupations. So, there is a lot that is needed from UNESCO in the coming years for furthering its mandate